So welcome everybody, and it's good to see your faces and your names, and good to see Professor Biernacki with us as well. And I know that people will continue to join, and I know that people will be interested, some of you, in watching this online after the fact. So I want to introduce Loriliai as associate professor, I believe, still associate professor Loriliai?
I'm actually up just about to, I'm up for full, and it's gone through a couple of the committees. So maybe in a couple of months or two, that will be a different, that will be different.
That's excellent. It's particularly good for Women's History Month, right?
Yeah.
There's this compression phenomenon. We need to move more and more women up to full. So University of Colorado in Boulder, beautiful place, Department of Religious Studies. And she works on Hinduism, ethics, gender, and tonight's topic, the intersection of religion and science. And her first book, and I love this title, Renowned Goddess of Desire, Women, Sex, and Speech in Tantra. Okay, so remember that title, ask her questions. Won the Caden Award in 2008. And she has had a long interest in the philosophy of Abhinavagupta, Kashmir Shaivism. And we collaborated together with she as co-editor and Philip Clayton of Claremont as the other co-editor of this wonderful book called Panentheism Across the World's Traditions. And we spent time up at Esalen together in the creation of this book. So it's with great delight that I welcome her to speak on a current topic of great interest to many, and that topic is transhumanism. So Loriliai, welcome on behalf of LMU Yoga Studies.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, it was very fun getting to work with you on that Esalen project, I have to say. Okay, so the title, I have a slideshow here as well too. I know it's sometimes annoying to look at a slideshow because then you can't really see the person. So we can decide whether that works or not, but I'll show you at least the first slides, and then maybe we'll toggle back and forth. Okay, let's see. Can you guys, I don't know if you can see, you can see this, right?
Yeah, we can see the screen.
Yeah, so if you do slideshow, it should work pretty well.
Okay, slideshow.
And then play from start.
Okay, go
back to slideshow.
This one right here.
Yeah.
Yeah, there we are. Excellent in all ways.
Okay, yeah, and I may get out of it at some points when I don't have a lot of slides, just because I know it's harder to see people, but just to start things. So this is called Subtle Bodies, AI Immortality, and a Fermentation Model of Self. Okay, that's the title of this paper. Okay, and I have an epigraph here. Did humans acquire microbes to enable them to build a better human, or did microbes design a better human as a new and improved vessel for their subsequent generations? And that comes from a book by Rodney Detached. Okay, so this presentation looks at, I'm gonna stop sharing for a moment here. Okay, so this presentation looks at the subtle body in relation to both a contemporary biology and a current technology of transhumanism. If we follow hopeful Google tech entrepreneurs like Ray Kurzweil, we see they propose a technological promise of human immortality. They say it is within reach, with the idea of an encodable self, our memories and desires as so many bits of information that might be detached from the physical body and transferred into a durable metallic body. I counter this here with a different model for self, a microbiological metaphor for thinking about incarnation in the body, a fermentation metaphor, what I will call here a yogurt model for self. This draws on Indian ideas of the subtle body to give us a different way of thinking about incarnation. We will look at images from Tantra at the slippery boundaries where a person leaves the body, disincarnates, particularly while still alive. I will give two examples that reveal a sense of the slippage between the body and the subtle body that can move between bodies in the case of yogis who leave their meditating bodies to inhabit other bodies. My project here is to borrow from current biology to offer other metaphors for thinking about what it means to be a self incarnated in a body. How might we rethink the idea of a soul, particularly a religious idea of a soul that detaches from the body at death? Or for us today, we find the secular equivalent of this idea in our current technology by way of Google tech entrepreneurs, again, like Ray Kurzweil, hoping for a robot immortality by downloading consciousness into a machine body. So here, again, instead of this, I suggest a yogurt model, a microbiological metaphor for thinking about what it means to be in a body. In what follows, in the interest of time, I'm going to leave out a section where I address in more detail what I mean precisely by the biology of bodies as fermentation. Basically, our current models neglect the complexity of life and other biological beings that make up what we think of as our bodies. I'm also going to leave out a section where I unpack why thinking about the idea of self as a process of fermentation makes more sense than our usual binary of body and soul. This binary, which, by the way, is still with us in our secular 21st century with our own contemporary binary of the body as inert matter and the self as information. I'm also going to leave out another section where I discuss how we get a sense of unity of self, even in the midst of the biological multiplicity that makes us up, and why it is a particularly tantric way of thinking about the body and self. So sorry to leave all this out, but this is to save time. This is an article that's coming out later in the year, so it'll be possible to read the whole piece later. Okay, so what we will look at then are images from Tantra that help us to understand what the body is, what it means to be in a body by looking at these slippery boundaries where a person leaves the body, particularly while still alive, a person leaves the body to inhabit a different body. In other words, in a William Jamesian type of thinking, what happens to embodiment in these exceptional cases? I'll give two examples that reveal a sense of the slippage between the body, physical body, and the subtle body that can move between physical bodies in the case of yogis who leave their meditating bodies to inhabit other bodies. Finally, to conclude, I will return to a current idea of the body as a simple binary via Ray Kurzweil's Google idea of downloading his consciousness into a robot body to explore what the metaphor of selfhood as fermentation might mean if extended into a metallic body. Okay, so that's the gist of what I'm going to cover. Let me share my screen again because I think I have this all in a, okay, let's try this. Okay, so this is basically the gist of what I'm going to cover here for the rest of, for the talk. Okay. Now, especially I want to bring a contemporary biological model to bear on Indian, particularly medieval tantric ideas of the body, since what tantric models share with our current biology is an already given appreciation of the body as the site of a multiplicity of agencies, where current biology maps this as the multitude of other species sharing the in and outside of our flesh in the midst of the microbiome, our complex endocrine systems, and genetic proclivities. Indian tantric models, on the other hand, understand this as a web of deities with different volitional proclivities mapped onto the subtle body, directing and inhabiting the physical body. Indeed, in this Indian tantric context, contrasting, for instance, other Indian models of a soul in a body, it is not so much an idea of an immaterial transcendent soul. inhabiting the physical body as it is the notion of another body, the subtle body, the Sukshma Sharira, the Puriyashtaka, the Linga Sharira, and Ativahika Sharira. These are names for the subtle body, inhabiting a physical body. So instead of a binary of an immaterial soul and a material body, we have rather a body within the body. In lieu of some pristine immaterial soul, we find just bodies, more or less subtle, more or less grossly physical. Okay, so let's see here. Abhinavagupta's 11th century Tantric panentheism nicely encapsulates this erasure of oppositional categories as he folds a conception of consciousness with its intelligence intimately within bodies, not separate from bodies, telling us that, which is the absolute, that consciousness alone is the highest ultimate body of all entities. Okay, so here we got this idea that consciousness basically is simply a body. It's just the most subtle body of bodies. Consciousness, so in Abhinavagupta's formulation, he abandons his own Indian legacy of dualism derived from Sankhya cosmology with its matter-consciousness split, a dualism which is actually akin to our familiar Cartesian body-mind duality. Instead, what characterizes the soul for Abhinavagupta, consciousness, is itself a body. Okay, so now let's explore this idea of the fermentation of bodies. Okay, so in 1985, two microbiologists, this is James Staley and Alan Konopka, finally gave a name to an utterly baffling phenomenon. If we take the wondrous diversity of microbial species from the human gut into the lab, they dwindle and die, to the astounding tune of almost 150 times fewer species. This is called the Great Plate Count Anomaly. This disappearance of species has puzzled microbiologists since 1898, when an Austrian, Heinrich Winterberg, noticed that the number of microbial cells in his samples did not match the number of colonies he attempted to culture. Somehow, the fermentation that happens in a live body, the explosion of species in the barely charted and vast world of microbiota filling out the spaces of our human bodies, cannot thrive in the sterile lab. For the microbiome, the body we experience as our own comprises an interconnected complexity hosting a multitude beyond our familiar sense of I. Indeed, as microbiologists tell us, 99% of the genetic information in the space of my human body is not from my genome at all, but rather part of a vast interconnection of different species. As David Relman puts it, our microbial inhabitants outnumber our own body cells by about 10 to 1. And similarly, Rodney Dietrich points out that we are, quote, a conglomerate of thousands of different species, quote, never alone, even in our own bodies. Okay, so I'm going to leave out another section here where I discuss a Cartesian model of self and body as binary and the critique of this by contemporary neuroscientists like Antonio Damasio. Okay, so I'll leave that out. In any case, for the West today, even with the scientific rejection of soul as an antiquated relic, still this regnant and lingering stereotype of a self inhabiting a dead, inert body seeps into our models, even into those like artificial intelligence, which should have seemingly banished it. For instance, Google engineer Ray Kurzweil has famously predicted the possibility of downloading human consciousness into machines recently with a target date of 2045, not too far off, just 20 years from now or so, or 23 years. Yet his book, The Singularity is Near, When Humans Transcend Biology, implicitly assumes the same sort of binary of body and essence. Here, it's no longer a spiritual essence, a soul, but instead it's what he calls information, a complex binary bit encoding of human intelligence and memory enhanced by an accelerating, hopeful technology defines our essence, wrapped in inert matter as the metal, silicon, and wiring making up the body inhabited by the download. The complexity of the body as we know it, including the microbial entanglement of all matter, disappears. It pretty much dwindles and dies, like the microbial, like what happens to the microbial environment in the laboratory. This pretty much dwindles and dies in Kurzweil's fantastic future. As Ed Yong tells us, each step we take, sipping coffee with a friend, leaves us in a wash in a sea of multiple species sharing our body's spaces. Not in Kurzweil's futurist vision. If, as new cutting-edge science on the body is just beginning to appreciate, if so much of our awareness is multiply engendered by a biology of other species, microbes, bacteria, sharing our spaces, then even the intelligence Kurzweil hopes to download depends deeply, precisely on this complexity of so many other beings, the microbial multitudes entangled within us and around us. What this new scientific awareness points to is this: so much more profoundly than we ever realized, the conglomerate of thousands of species in our fleshy gut drive our desires, our intelligence, our moods, our sense of self. Whether we are happy or depressed can be traced to whether we share our space with Faecalibacterium and Coprococcus bacteria and Dialister, irregardless of any antidepressants we might be taking. Who we are psychologically, emotionally, intellectually depends profoundly on these other species, inhabitants of our second brain in the gut. In either case, neither the legacy of a soul that dogs us nor its replacement with the idea of information offers us much space to acknowledge the complexity of living, of incarnating in a human body. The body, with its web of conflicting affective physical needs, complexly interacting at times with contradictory pushes and pulls with the multiplicity of species both within and outside its visible boundaries, and these within the chemical sea of a complex endocrinology, this body eludes an easy binary. This information and body, this binary just doesn't really cut it. Nor does this dominant bare binary of soul and body or its informational stand-in help us to make sense of the body's widely reported, if uncanny, capacities to project a sense of its vitality outside its proper fleshy boundaries. This latter capacity, where a sense of self habitually tied to the body is projected outside the body's physical limits, hints at the phenomenological scaffolding for the idea of a soul separate from the body. As such, the idea that some awareness, some consciousness connected to the body, tethered to the body as its home, can also at times leave the body, the subtle body or astral travel as it's popularly known. This forms the stuff of a wide-ranging cross-cultural phenomenon embedded across much mystical and religious experience, apart from any particular religious tradition's doctrinal revelations, and phenomenologically, it may be where we get the idea of a soul in the first place. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about, we're moving to the next section called fermentation, milk into curds. I'm going to truncate this section. If we take seriously the biology of our bodies, the multiplicity of species intimately connected to and generative of the production of a self, of our emotions, our memories, then our old familiar Cartesian binary of mind and matter seems to miss the mark. It neglects the inescapable entanglement that is the body's participation in a sense of self. In the interest of time, I'm going to delete here a section where I discuss the idea of fermentation, yogurt and kombucha, and how they present a multiplicity of species bringing about a unity of flavor, and how we might compare this to our own sense of unity, even though our bodies comprise a host of different bacterial species. I suggest that a metaphor of fermentation does not just mean the body acts on its biology, but that thoughts, even as they are influenced by biology in the body, also in turn push back against the body's biology, steering it in a particular direction. This, of course, is one of the driving desires of a practice of yoga and meditation in India historically, particularly of Tantra, using the mind to transform the body's biology. Indeed, what is so interesting about a Tantric conception of subtle body is precisely its attempt to complicate and rework a notion of self away from a simple binary of a transcendent consciousness on the one side and an insentient body, move away from this binary towards a recognition of a multiplicity of agencies within the body. In the Tantric case, the body contains a multiplicity of agencies as various gods, filling out, inhabiting the subtle body. As Abhinavagupta tells us, Brahma is in the heart, Vishnu is in the throat, and Rudra is in the third eye, and so on. The subtle body itself within tantric practice is cultivated like a good cheese with an initial inoculation, i.e., in this case, the initiation, the diksha that sets the practitioner on the path. This, as formal ritual, nearly always involves the physical body. And then comes the abhyasa, the practice, including nyasa, a particular tantric practice where the practitioner daily mentally constructs the subtle body by visualizing deities in various limbs, as well as the daily mantra repetition as the mild and repeated warmth that allows the culture to grow. Through this, the self, subtle and physical bodies of the practitioner transform, leading to enlightenment and usually also a better sort of body. Okay, so that's really what Tantra adds to the mix that we don't find in earlier traditions of yoga, this better sort of body. Of course, we are dealing simply with metaphors mapping how we understand what it means to be a self. But what we gain from a fermentation model, my yogurt model, is precisely a way of understanding the multiplicity that makes up the biological model. This also affords us a way of thinking about the unruly multiplicity of agencies that the tantric subtle body, with its various gods in the heart and the throat and navel as well, brings into the mix. So this notion of fermentation as metaphor for what it means to be in a body gestures towards our foundational multiplicity. We are always already a mixture of various selves fermenting us. Some pristine idea of identity is itself an illusion. This conception of various selves fermenting us is especially apt in the context of tantric ritual, where the cultivation of a transformed self occurs through visualizing various deities in the body. Their agencies ferment the practitioner both through mental visualization and the subtle whispered sounds of the initiation mantra to slowly redefine the subtle body and the physical body of the practitioner. A caveat here. We should note still that it is not only in just the West that we find a binary of body and spirit. Classical Indian theology as well subscribes to an idea of the soul as separate from the body, not tantric, but classical Indian philosophy. So Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita tells us that the soul is an immortal entity, untouched by fire or water or death. It discards its bodies, an old one for a new one, as we wear out old clothes, tossing old away for new. This early Samkhya conception of a self or soul tied to an individual eventually gives way to a highly refined and expansive notion of self in the later monisms. So arising out of the creative foment of dialogue between Advaita Vedanta with especially Buddhism, the Atman, the self, expands from the idea of an individual self or soul, as in Sankhya, and in Olivell's work as well, connecting to the body. So it expands from the idea of a self or soul of an individual, as in Sankhya, to something like a formal principle containing all selves in later Advaita traditions. In any case, Shankara himself, the doyen of Advaita Vedanta, also employs a metaphor of fermentation. In his case, however, rather than using yogurt as a way of understanding how the multiplicity that makes up the body might be understood to generate a sense of self, he takes the reverse tack. He suggests that the process of fermentation, where milk becomes yogurt, demonstrates how the absolute Brahman transforms from a singular unity to generate the multiplicity that we see in the world. I'll give you another slide here. This occurs in his Brahma Sutra Bhasha, Sutra 2124, where he discusses how the absolute Brahman does not need some other material to create the world. Here, Badarayana's root verse laconically tells us, if one says because one sees a collection, Brahman is not the cause of the world, indeed it's not so, because it's like milk, i.e. yogurt. Shankara elaborates, telling us that just as with milk, which can transform into yogurt all by itself without any additional thing added, so Brahman can create the world without relying on something external. The word parinama that Shankara uses here references an idea of transformation, but Shankara is clear, not the idea of something like an emergentist model, which rises above and leaves behind the materiality that engenders it. Rather, the milk itself, in its own essential substance, simply transforms. It ferments into some new form, yogurt, the same substance taking a different form. For Shankara, the process of becoming yogurt derives from a power within milk, not from the heat outside, but from itself. Similarly, the absolute Brahman draws on its own diverse powers, Vichitra Shakti, to transform from a unitary substantive reality to then generate a world of multiplicity and difference. Shankara's use of yogurt as metaphor leaves out, of course, the multiplicity of species already swimming invisibly in the milk, waiting to ferment and digest it into yogurt, unseen to us with our limited eyesight. Yet this multiplicity as the absolute Brahman's various powers, the Vichitra Shakti, also necessarily signals the diversity of agential capacities. These are the powers waiting to ferment and transform milk or Brahman into some new form. It is these various powers, these Vichitra Shakti, that come to play the role of the various gods within the Tantric body. For our purposes, I suspect it is no accident that even for Shankara's use of the metaphor of yogurt is that it affords a way to pass between unity and multiplicity without falling into a chasm of impossibly different substances. For Shankara as well, fermentation as metaphor helps him to avoid a philosophically noxious dualism. So I'm going to move into the next section called the body snatchers. If, as I suggest, Tantric texts preferentially favor a model akin to what I think of as a yogurt metaphor for incarnation, though mostly unarticulated, then what happens in stories of yogis leaving his or her proper body to inhabit someone else's body? As we might suspect, inhabiting a body, one's own or someone else's, is about the subtle body that resides within the physical body. When a yogi leaves the body, he or she leaves as a subtle body. When a yogi enters another body, again, it is the subtle body that does the entering. The idea of self plays out as a process of mutual interactivity between what is physical and what is subtle among the body's various agencies. This includes the body's senses, taste, touch, and so on, the body's desires as well, and with this, the mind as particularly as a component of the subtle body, the suksha, sharira, puryashtaka, and so on, along with the breath, the prana, which is a primary element of this refined subtle body. Even as we often see in popular texts a loose dichotomy of mind and body, still the influence of Tantra demonstrates a notion of self as fairly synonymous with the subtle body, particularly moving about and operating through the subtle body's key component of prana or breath. That is, with Tantra, what we see is our subtle bodies inhabiting physical bodies. The binary of body and soul is just a subtle body and physical body, just different sorts of bodies. Okay, let me give you another slide here. In what follows below, we will look at the slippery boundaries of incarnation, where a yogi, by means of the subtle body, enters into a different physical body. I'll give two examples that reveal a sense of the slippage between the subtle body and the physical body. I take the first example from a 14th century text, the Srimad Shankara Dikvijaya, a hagiography of the famous Advaita Vedanta philosopher Shankara, whose explanation of milk becoming yogurt that we saw in the previous section. This text purports to narrate the life of Shankara, and sprinkled liberally throughout are didactic sections detailing Shankara's non-dualist philosophy in basic terms as he schools the various people he encounters. The text's author, Madhavacharya Vidyaranya Swami, writes this hagiography a good 6 to 7 centuries after Shankara's death. And as we might expect from a hagiography, miracles abound. The narrative of Shankara's life, mixed in with a rehearsal of his philosophical metaphysics, curiously leaves the text with a fascinating tension between a didactic iteration of Shankara's non-dualist philosophy, where the self, the Atman, as pure consciousness, is not at all tied to a body on the one hand, and Shankara's own life story, where his siddhis, his miraculous feats, are inextricably tied to the subtle body and his mastery of it. Admittedly, the work is geared less to a philosophical precision and rather more to a popular appreciation of a celebrated figure, which makes it quite interesting as the inherent friction between an Advaita Vedanta monist sense of self clashes with the story's implicit embrace of tantric understandings of a subtle body. The other example I offer comes from an 11th century Kashmiri text, Somadeva's Katasarit Ocean of the Rivers of Story, a well-known collection of Indian stories. This second example differs from Shankara's story in that while Shankara eventually makes it back to his original body after his sojourn in King Amaruka's body, Yogananda is not so lucky and winds up stuck in the body of the dead king he inhabits. What one gathers from both of these stories is precisely the acknowledgement of influence the physical body has on the subtle body within it, on the interactivity between the subtle body, including the person's mind, and the physical body that the subtle body inhabits. The subtle body is, in fact, quite susceptible to the pulls of the physical body. The mind, even for a yogi, is altered depending upon the body one inhabits. And with this, the mind, it's also what we might say the self itself is altered. The longer a yogi stays in someone else's body, a king's body, instead of a Brahmin yogi's body, the more the yogi changes, the more the yogi forgets his previous identity. Moreover, one cannot attribute the change in the yogi to the influence from the soul of the king whose body the yogi inhabits, since in the stories we see below, the original kingly owners of these bodies have left. They've died and moved on to presumably their next incarnations, heaven or hell or rebirth. These yogis hop into corpses, freshly dead, but still presumably vacant property. With this, I mean to point out that the change the yogi undergoes comes directly from the body the yogi inhabits and is not the effect of some other person, some other spirit or subtle body messing with the yogi's mind. It is all just the influence of the new physical body. Another slide here. For Shankara's case, the context is his debate with the Mimamsa scholar Mandana Mishra's wife, Bharati. Bharati, knowing that Shankara has been an ascetic from birth, challenges Shankara on the science of love. Shankara requests a month-long reprieve from the debate. He's an ascetic after all. You know, he's a monk, so he doesn't really know too much about sex. So he requests a month-long reprieve from the debate and leaves to go find a newly dead king, Amaruka, so he can enter the king's dead body in order to experience life in Amaruka's harem. Describing the process, the text tells us that Shankara, through the strength of his guru yoga, enters the king's body with his subtle body, Ativahika Sharira. That's the word that we have here for subtle body. The description of entering the king's dead body involves the subtle body, specifically as the breath, leading it from the toe up through the fissure in the top of the head. So I'll give you a description of the process here. Madhava Vijaranya tells us, and this is a quote from the text, that knower of yoga, beginning with the toe, leading the breath up through the path of the fissure, and then having gone outside his original body, slowly he enters through the path of the fissure at the top of the head of the dead body, extending completely down to the foot. So that's the process. The process involves Shankara exiting his own body through the top of his head by leading his breath as subtle body and then entering via the breath into the dead king's body, again through the fissure at the top of the king's head and extending down through the body into the feet. The process is all about the subtle body. After this, the dead king wakes up, seemingly revives from a near-death experience. His wives are delighted and the ministers eventually suspect that this is not their old king, since this newly resuscitated king is far more virtuous after he comes back from the dead. You must have noticed that all the stories of people who have near-death experiences, they come back and they're so much more wise. Okay, this happens in this text as well also. Given Shankara's non-dualism, where the body is simply the product of Maya, illusion, where indeed knowledge itself is the province of an all-pervasive Atman, the self that is eternal and pure consciousness, one wonders, why does Shankara need to gain this knowledge through the body at all? Why does he not just simply access the infinite knowingness of the self, which contains all that is to be known, simply through a profound meditation? At least if he chose that route, he would not risk the inevitable censure that arises for breaking his vow of celibacy. That is, if his subtle body experiences sex, how different is that than experiencing it with a physical body? So that's something just ponder. If you have anybody has a question, an answer to that at the end of the talk. And on the other hand, if it is the self, the Atman, as in Shankara's non-dualism, a pristine bodiless formulation which then inhabits a body in order to learn about sex, then clearly the Atman does not contain the sum of all knowledge. If it did, it would not need to inhabit a body to get this knowledge. The illusory Maya-engulfed body has something that the self, the Atman, does not have. It has some knowledge that one can only get through a body. Here, philosophy is set aside for the sake of a good story. Shankara's deep knowledge of the self is of no avail. Instead, this Tantra-influenced popular text sets Shankara on a subtle body adventure. Moreover, the image of incarnation we see is a model of the subtle body within the physical body. Further, there is a mutual interaction. The physical body influences the subtle body, and vice versa. Thus, for our purposes here, what is most interesting is what occurs after Shankara has spent his month in the dead king's body. When the month passes, and it's time for Shankara to return to his original body, and the disciples guarding his body so that he can go back and finish the debate, he does not show up. What happens is that Shankara transforms. After running the kingdom for a short time, he squirrels himself away in the inner compartment of the palace with the women in the harem. He gets caught up in the pleasures of the body and he misses his appointment to return. He forgets. His newly acquired king's body, even in the very short span of a single month, carries too much influence over his subtle body, over his mind, over his self, for him not to be transformed, fermented, we might say, into a different sort of self, no longer an ascetic yogi. In his case, his disciples do not know what to do when he does not show up. They decide they need to search out for any recently dead kings who might have miraculously revived and appear more benevolent than before death. They find the likely prospect in the resuscitated King Amaruka and finagle their way into the court as musicians to try to make contact with Shankara. They are successful, and their musical renditions of Advaita Vedanta philosophy reach through to some not yet transformed recollection of his former awareness as an ascetic monk. All's well that ends well, and he returns to his original body. Of course, the court ministers and the king's wives are probably not too happy when he handsomely rewards the musicians for their musical program and then promptly falls down unconscious. Madhava Vidyaranya seems too squeamish to point out that Shankara's return to his original body means the death of the king. He hesitates to use the word death, mrityu, which we saw earlier, and instead opts for a swoon, morcha, in Srimad Shankara Digvijaya 1057. What we can note here is just how powerfully influential the body is for Shankara, who in this text is the epitome of knowers of the self, an incarnation of the great god Shiva. That someone of his stature of enlightenment can be swayed by the body's proclivities, leaving him forgetfully sequestered with his wives, even after only a very short span of a single month, indicates that the body molds the person, the body ferments the person, the body defines the person's self. The body is not inert. The newly inhabited body transforms the choices of the person sharing the body's space. That is, the matter of the body matters. The shape of material ensconcement, the body with its own agential desires, sculpts, ferments the person. Thus, a binary of self and body with an idea of some sort of hermetically sealed self, impervious to the agencies of the bodies, is not a part of this narrative. Instead, this tantrically inspired formulation of the body gives us a subtle body within a physical body and a fermentation between these bodies. Our other example from the Kathasadit Sagara, Ocean of the Rivers of Story, it's a translation of the text, involves a yogi named Indradatta. He and his two fellow celibate students need to give a payment to their teacher and decide to go ask King Nanda for the payment as alms. Unfortunately, as soon as they arrive in Ayodhya, the king's city, they hear that the king has died. Indradatta has the siddhi, the yogic skill, to leave his body and enter into another body. So he comes up with a plan to enter into the dead king's body, while his fellow student, Biernacki, guards his own body. And then the third fellow student, Vararuchi, will petition the king, inhabited by Indradatta, for the money they need to pay their teacher. Somadeva tells us, this is a quote from the text, having said this, Indradatta entered into the body of Nanda. When the king came back to life, there was a great celebration in the country. Here, to describe the process of entering into the king's body, Somadeva uses the word samavishat, literally translating as completely entering into. The root vish with the long prefix a, prefix, denotes the kind of possession where a spirit possesses some person. It typically carries at least a little hint of an unsavory whiff of lower spirits, not gods, possessing a person, even if it is also used in particular rites where a person is possessed by a deity. Meanwhile, also in the 11th century, also in Kashmir, this same word, the root vish, with its two prefixes, sam and a, gets taken up by the polymath Tantric Abhinavagupta, who reworks its connotations to shift it more towards a sanitized conception of a deep meditative trance. Both for Abhinavagupta and for the kinds of unruly possession states associated with the term avesha, the subtle body is implicated. One transforms the subtle body by entering into this sort of state of possession, mixing, fermenting the agencies of possessor and possessed, bodies included, subtle and physical. In any case, unfortunately for Indradatta, King Nanda's wise minister realizes rather quickly that this is a yogi walk-in into the dead king's body. He immediately sends soldiers to burn all comatose-like bodies, and Indradatta's fellow student and protector, Vyadi, is helpless, unable to save Indradatta's original body. When he discovers the news, Indradatta, now going by the name Yogananda, laments. Let me give you another slide here. Somadeva tells us, Yogananda, now realizing, then said with sorrow to Vyadi, I, who am a Brahmin sage, have become a low caste Shudra. What's the use of my fortune, even if it's a lot of solid money? So Indradatta Yogananda loses his Brahmin body, which is replaced by a low caste Shudra body, and due to the influence of the body, it is all downhill after that. Indradatta / Yogananda starts to change. The influence of this new king's body affects his state of mind so that eventually he becomes caught up in the desires of his new body, full of passion and jealousy. Somadeva tells us, with time, Yogananda now came under the control of desire, and so on. Like a kingly elephant gone mad, he paid no regard to anything whatsoever. Eventually, in time, he loses entirely his former yogic disposition, becomes prone to anger, orders his friends killed, and is finally himself killed by the minister who first recognized his yogic body snatching. This tale of woe aptly depicts just how profoundly the body intervenes in one's state of consciousness, and that this transformative interaction is always a moving target, a process, a fermentation of self through the physical body and the subtle body's agencies. So we'll go to this fifth section here called Becoming Metal. This is our last section here, I believe. If body snatching is a perilous venture, prone to loss of one's former self, what might it mean for humans of the 21st and 22nd centuries to move ourselves into metallic bodies, the kinds of robots Kurzweil predicts will grant us immortality? This fantastic dream of a seemingly incorruptible body is not really a new idea for humans. Early in the first millennium, nearly 2,000 years ago, Jain Digambaras, the sky-clad naked ascetics of early India, also espoused this ideal. The enlightened Jain ascetic, the Tirthankara, through dint of intense asceticism, could also acquire a diamond-hard body, impervious to the world, impenetrable. He did not need to eat or drink or defecate. Let me just get rid of the share for the moment. He did not need to eat or drink or defecate, nor did he even speak for that matter. Instead, his body just emitted a hum that his close followers interpreted for those who came to see him. Yet if, as current biology tells us, so much of who we are as bodies is shaped and determined on physical and mental levels by that multitude of others, the microbial community with whom we share our space, then what becomes of them and us if the terrain of the body transforms into Kurzweil's durable metal and nanobots? That is, if the body, what the body is made of matters, as microbiologists have discovered with the great plate count anomaly, when vast numbers of species simply died when cultures were moved from living bodies to the metal and glass of the lab, how will these species fare with Kurzweil's transistor fabricated bodies? And just as Shankara's sojourn in a different sort of body changes his priorities, changes his personality, what if becoming metal changes the biostructure of subjectivity? This is not so far-fetched. Even at this very early stage of exploring the body's interactions, we already have studies that show that the more metal in the body, specifically the presence of tungsten, lead, and thallium, lead to higher rates of autism. Moreover, metals like zinc and tungsten affect which bacteria in the microbiome flourish and which do not, with real effects on how people feel psychologically and physically. Even seemingly inert metals like titanium used for hip replacements, due to its perceived stability, its imperviousness to breaking down in the body, turn out to be more reactive than we thought, with titanium leaching into the bloodstream, affecting biological processes elsewhere in the body. In fact, metals incorporated into the body provide their own spaces for niche populations of microbes to grow, shifting the body's microbial population, just as the stainless steel doorknobs in hospitals offer a wonderful terrain for the growth of MRSA. The matter of the body matters. What our new improved cyborg bodies are made of will certainly engender a difference in our microbial partners. As a result, it will likely affect our emotions, our choices, our own sense of self. What if becoming metal consequently leaves us with a different or diminished subjectivity? Even as Kurzweil, in his manifesto, The Singularity is Near, offers a response to a variety of criticisms. For instance, criticism based on the problems with software stability, criticisms based on the problems arising from the wealthy monopolizing the benefits of new technology, criticisms from a theistic perspective, and so on. Still, the idea that the material of the body, metals and silicon versus flesh, wiring and metal cells and wiring versus the idea of flesh and its multiplicity of co-inhabitants, ubiquitous life, bacteria, microbes, virus pervading every inch. This idea of what the material that the body is made of, this is not at all on his radar. Apart from the biome, Kurzweil also dismisses the body's own complex structures. He tells us that we do not need to replicate all the neuronal firings of the brain, and we do not need to replicate its structure. Most of the details in the brain, he tells us, are random, and thus we do not have to model the brain entirely. We just need to be able to transmit the relevant information, not, quote, every dimple on the surface of every dendrite, end quote. Even if Kurzweil acknowledges the brain's actual structure, parallel processing, and analog with extensive nonlinear reactions is quite different from the digital computer he proposes as the locus for a download of a particular person's thought and memory, still he believes that if we can achieve the same amount of computing power, roughly 10 to the 16th computations per second, then the digital computer model he proposes will, in his estimate, be functionally equivalent. He's banking on the idea that there's no real difference between nonlinear analog modes and digital computation. That is, he's banking on the idea that the shape of the body, its basic matter and structure do not matter. We should be wary, though. By limiting what is considered, quote, relevant information, eliminating what Kurzweil believes to be the random and thus seemingly useless details, we may unwittingly steer into enormously limiting algorithms. I'm reminded here of Joy Hualamwini's TEDx talk on what she calls the coded gaze, where the computer's face recognition software cannot see her black face at all because the algorithm left out some seemingly useless details, leading it to only see white faces. In any case, Kurzweil's 21st century rendition of the age-old desire for an impervious body, immortal body, what he calls the human body version 2.0, will, he tells us, be more non-biological than biological by the 2030s. Kurzweil envisions redesigning the digestive systems, how we eat, giving us phytonutrients delivered to the body through the bloodstream by metallic nanobots, while sensors in our bloodstream and body using wireless communication will provide dynamic information on the nutrients needed at each point in time. With this, humans could wear a special nutrient device in a belt, which could be delivered by nanobots that would enter our bodies through skin or body cavities. This way, we get a modified digestive tract, so we can eat what we want, but it does not get absorbed into the bloodstream, since we get nutrients instead from a little nutrient which is different, and eating would just be for pleasure. That way we can eat decadent things with no penalty. Plus, we would not have to go to the bathroom. Instead, we could have little elimination nanobots that act, and this is a quote, that act like tiny garbage compactors, end quote, sweeping the trash out. We could also have little storage tanks inside the body, so we would not need to eat so frequently. Like his Jain counterpart 2 millennia ago, he proposes a body with no need of eating or defecating. The possibilities are stunning. With this new nanobot system, we could outgrow the need for kidneys. We could even choose to have a heart or not, since we could just have metallic nanobot blood cells. Nanorobotic blood cells could supply their own energy, so no need for a heart. And these nanobots, unlike our current tiny multiple microbial species hanging out in our body spaces, these nanobots will be controlled by us. That is, unless they manage to start replicating out of control. One worry, he tells us, is what he calls the gray goo situation. For nanobots to be feasible for our human needs, they will have to be self-replicating. They need carbon to replicate. If perchance the programming goes astray or some virus infects the program, it will be far worse than our current biological viruses hijacking the body. Kurzweil's worry is that unchecked self-replicating nanobots could fairly quickly turn everything into what he calls a gray goo, eating not just our human bodies, but in their quest to self-replicate, hijacking all the carbon on the earth in just a matter of a few weeks to destroy the entire earth, leaving only a gray goo. This probably tops even Ebola. To bring this back to fermentation, what we learn from this is that the body itself is part of what makes up the consciousness of a person. What one consciousness itself is the product of multiple agencies within the body, symbiotically interacting, fermenting it. Kurzweil's fond dream of downloading his consciousness indefinitely into a computer depends precisely on a cosmology of a mind-body split, as if consciousness were actually something apart from the body and not itself intimately entwined with the body, fermented like yogurt within the biological multiplicity that the body already is. In other words, don't hold your breath. Okay, that's it.
What a great conclusion. Don't hold your breath. And the breath, of course, we know from the Upanishads and from our own life experience, is absolutely essential to life. And I wanted to start by musing about the subtle body, which you've brought up so effectively, but say that if we look at Jain literature and if we look at Hindu and Buddhist literature, and we look at that idea of self-soul consciousness, but the alaya vijnana and the buddhi, where the bhavas, all of the karmic impressions reside that then find expression, it would seem that if we look at, say, the Sankhyakarika, it says that there's this subtle body. It gets lodged in the body born of mother and father. And then the third part is that we have our will. But it also says in that text that whatever desires remain unfulfilled transmigrate into a new body and seek expression. And if we look at Battlestar Galactica, we see this wonderful narrative when in fact we are part robot, and we're part robot that took those memories and then gets regenerated into a new body. So it's a little bit of a mashup, but I think that there's a neglect of what the traditional literature already posits about the singularity actually always being a multi-layered reality. So any feedback on that? And we have some wonderful comments in the chat as well.
Yes, I mean, one of the main things I want to argue against is this idea that we can separate out consciousness from the body in a way that I think the Tantric model really is better. And I think the Tantric model really relies on a notion of this interaction, this yogurt, this fermentation that always happens with the body. I mean, I think Sankhya does have this earlier model and it gets taken up, but I think that one of the things that Tantra adds, which I think is so profound about, and with such perspicacity that Tantra adds, is this idea that it's really bodies all the way down, okay? Now, Battlestar Galactica, yeah, you know, I love that show. It was fantastic. And every time I would see it though, I couldn't help but always think, those robots are not robots. They're actually humans, you know, they're human actors playing. So, I mean, I guess what I'm skeptical of is that, I mean, maybe we could, you know, make bodies that would be robots, but that would really actually be like human bodies. But I don't think I think that what all of these things leave out is the fact that the body matters, you know, that what the body is made of always matters, and that always gets glossed over. You know, I mean, I think his gray goo scenario makes a lot of sense, and you know, to quote some more sci-fi, it makes me think, you know, also of like there's some, I don't know if you've seen this Stargate at all, that other TV show that went on for like 10 seasons or something, that there's one episode there that I remember where I think, or maybe it's more than one episode, they're encountered this species that basically devours up everything and transforms it into itself, you know. And so you know, and that's what I think that's what his gray goo thing is all about, you know. And I think that I think that the whole point of this is also that evolution itself is a process that takes the whole into account and doesn't just sort of like jump from some notion of you know, you have a consciousness, which is information that is the Lord of everything, which can then sort of like control over whatever body you want to put it in. I think that's sort of that whole model, I think, is deeply flawed, and that most of the Silicon Valley AI tech guys don't understand how flawed their model is, because they're really relying on a Cartesian model. So that's sort of the gist of, you know, what I think about that. And then, you know, and I'll be curious to see also, you know, how does Sankhya and earlier yoga, before we get Tantra, how do they actually sort of accommodate these ideas as well also?
Yeah, that's great. I'm going to read you some of the comments. So Gayatri Sehgal says, amazing, and cites a book about microorganisms called I Contain Multitudes.
I've seen that book. Yeah, that's great.
Multicellular organisms evolved by single cell microorganisms working together. Evolution required love and communal support. There's theories and evidence that they would hold each other's flagella like hands in a circle.
Yeah, that's fantastic, Gayatri. That's fantastic. That also makes me think as well of like, you know, some of the revolutions that occurred with, let's see, what's her name, who sort of came up with the idea that the mitochondria actually merged with the cell to form.
Yeah, Lynn Margulis.
Yeah, Lynn Margulis.
Yeah.
Just so many of her ideas were so influential, and she's saying precisely what you're saying here as well, Gayatri, this whole idea that really the model is not one element overriding and ruling over the other, but a kind of cooperation, you know. So the body needs to cooperate with the consciousness. Yeah, go ahead, Gayatri, you're going to say something?
Oh yeah, this other professor who was like a PhD in biology, he left his Dr. Bruce Lipton. I'm not sure if you've heard of him.
Yes, I've seen his name. Yeah, he looks really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So he also talks about how all of that is connected, and he started writing scholarly papers about how biology is based on like basically healing. He's focused on healing, but like our mind controls like what happens in our body and then goes to that microcellular level. So I feel like your work intersects with his as well in that way.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't read his stuff in depth, but I think I come across his name a couple of times and looked a little bit at what he seems to be saying, and I agree with you. It's like his stuff looks super interesting. Yeah, and I think it's connected.
Yeah, and the other thing, emotions, very important, and they aren't necessarily going to fit into a computer. So Kunal Muli says, in the fermentation model, what happens to the living being after death, and what is the mechanism?
That's a great question, Kunal. That's a really good question. So basically the way that I think this works, and I hear again, I think we just use the Tantric model, it's bodies all the way down. So what happens out to the living being after death is basically that the subtle body is now sort of carrying these energies, and they're carrying these energies and fermenting them still within what's known as the subtle body, okay? So what is the subtle body? Well, it's especially made up of gods, okay? So that what you have here always, when you're in a physical body, you've got the physical components, and you've also got a variety of gods that are actually running a lot of the show. So I'm saying that the gods are quite, I mean, now this is a kind of, I have not written about this idea, but I have been thinking about this idea quite a while now. And that is this sort of, as above, so below, this idea that what happens on a subtle level almost always gets instantiated on a physical level as well. So what happens in the realm of the gods happens also in the realm of the human, and also happens in the realm of physical bodies as well also. So in this regard, what happens to the living being after death is that all of these things get taken up, which are sort of the imprints of the physical body that actually fermented also within and with the subtle body, which is also just a body, and that process continues on. Okay. Now, is there, we'll have to ask Chris this question: is there such a thing as a kind of enlightenment which is completely beyond all bodies? Okay. Now, Abhinavagupta says, really, in the quote that I gave you, that it's really bodies all the way down. What happens is the bodies get bigger and more expansive, and so that consciousness itself is the body of everything that exists, and that includes spirits who are just subtly embodied with subtle bodies, and then the physicality of the rest of what we see all around here. Now, that also gives, it's a great question, Kunal. It also gives us another idea, another model of like, that you find really cross-culturally as well too, and that is that we're here in these physical bodies, but there are also all kinds of spirits all around us always, like water spirits and other dead people hanging around. You probably saw that movie, the Kids Who Sees Dead People, this kind of stuff. So really what that gives us is a different kind of a model that's both the unity in that consciousness itself is the body of all, but that breaks down into different kinds of bodies all the way through, which work and interact, back to Gayatri's point, which work and interact in a kind of cooperation all the way through. Okay, but we could see, to you, Chris, in terms of what, this idea, like, is there a consciousness that can transcend this body, any kind of the idea of body at all? That's the question.
Yeah, the Jains say, no, you keep your body even when you're in the Siddhaloka. And that I find really quite fascinating. And then, Kunal, I don't know if you want to unmute and talk, but your next question is about fermentation, nadis, and the physical body.
Yeah, I just want to get a little bit of your understanding on what is the relationship between the subtle body and matter at the end of the day. If we are able to solve this question, won't we be able to bring this model into like mainstream science or something? So, I mean, I'm extremely curious what you have to say to this.
Yeah, no, this is also a really, really good question. Again, it's this idea that the subtle body also sort of works in tandem with the physical body. Okay, so the meridians and the channels, the nadis, are actually also sort of playing out within the physical body. So the two are always working together. It is a process of fermentation because they're both bodies. Okay, so you know, and so again, I think that because of the nature of this process of fermentation, I left out a whole section of the paper where I talk about how do we get a sense of unity from it all. But the idea behind that is that, you know, when you make a fine cheese, which is a process of fermentation, or yogurt, if it's done properly, you do get a sense of unity within all of these different components. And I think that you can take that metaphor and apply it as well to the relationship between the subtle body and the physical body. That is, there's a constant interaction between the two. So what you say with your mind and your subtle body, with the prana, with meditation, what the subtle body does actually affects what the physical body does, what happens on the level of the physical body, and vice versa. I don't know if that helps to answer your question. I think that this actually is something that you can actually sort of really verify for yourself vis-a-vis your own yogic practices. Okay. And yes, it would be fantastic if the scientific world would start to sort of recognize this. I think that our science and our technology is woefully inadequate in this respect, you know, particularly like look at Kurzweil, people like Kurzweil who are calling many of the shots. They're really stuck on an old model of like, you know, the consciousness is just AI and we can download it, you know? So I don't have too much hope for them getting it. I have hope for people like you getting it, you know? And maybe the next generation of scientists will start to sort of incorporate this in new models that we come up with. But really good questions. Yeah, really good questions.
Thank you.
Yeah, and if you have any more questions to ask or anything to add to it, please chime in at any point as well, okay?
I have plenty more questions, but I'll probably email you at some point.
Okay,
Yeah.
and okay.
I'm a scientist at Caltech, by the way, so
Okay.
I work on consciousness and astrophysics, so I think about all these things all the time.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think that the whole theory of vasanas and samskaras, seeking expression, it's very important. And it's more than just literary, it's emotional, and the emotional is also electromagnetic. And one of my students, and I'd be really interested, Kunal, if you've run into any of this research, I have a master's thesis that I'm directing where this woman has found, one of my students, I think she's on the program here, Teresa Portugues, but she's working with some experiments that she's seen written up that correlate spinal fluid with chakra locations within the body. And I think-
I would be extremely interested in knowing more about that. So let's connect offline, I guess.
Excellent, excellent. And then George Finley says, when the time is right, can we leave the body and just not come back?
Well, you know, George, you may know about the practice called Poa, which is a Tibetan Buddhist practice, which is a practice where you practice sort of leaving the body, okay? So that when the time is right, you can do it rather seamlessly. And then you'll have a little bit, the idea there is that if you can reach a certain level of consciousness, awareness, etc., you will be able to you'll be able to have a little bit more sort of awareness in the process and not be subject to karmic repercussions. Okay, so you know, so through a certain amount of practice, you can become more aware, and then you can, you can leave the body and not necessarily come back. I mean, it doesn't mean you won't have a body, it just means that you'll have a subtle body. And, you know, from my own understanding of, you know, reading various things and, you know, thinking about this and etc., my understanding is that, you know, what you do here, if you get to a certain point, you can leave the body, not come back, but you have to be able to sort of have a big enough of a subtle body so that you don't, so that you're not compelled to work out some other karmas that you have left. That's the, you know, and this is the whole idea of, I mean, and Abhinavagupta as well talks about this idea of like, once a person dies, so he breaks it up into this thing he called the three different types of malas. So karma mala, maya mala, okay, and anabha mala, which is like the mala, the impurity of karma, the impurity of seeing things as a duality, and the impurity of actually a sort of an innate impurity where one considers oneself limited. And he says that he says that like what's good about yoga and Sankhya in these earlier traditions is that they talk about getting rid of this karma mala, this impurity related to karma, and that once you've gotten rid of that, you actually don't have to be reborn again in a physical body here. It doesn't mean you don't have a body. It just means that you've advanced far enough along that you don't have to take on another physical body, but you still have anava mala and the sort of innate sense of smallness and a sense of seeing things in dualistic terms that you have to sort of learn how to sort of overcome in order to sort of then really get completely enlightened. Okay, so but yeah, sure, there are practices you can do to actually sort of figure out how to, when you leave your body, to not necessarily come back. I'm sure Chris can help you on that.
So then Lori Fazio asked, does the model, and Lori, I'm wondering which model, the Kurzweil model or the Abhinavagupta model, but the question is, does the model consider time to be linear?
Oh, that's a great question, Lori. That's a really good question. Okay, now I don't talk about this in the paper, but I'm just drawing from Abhinavagupta on this tantric model from Abhinavagupta on this. And what if indeed you're asking about what the tantric model says, what he says basically is that time as a universal still does exist. So there is still time. However, when you're not attached to the physical body, time works a little bit differently. I do talk about this in a book that I have coming out with Oxford later this year. It's called The Matter of Wonder, Abhinavagupta's Panentheism and New Materialism, where I think I talk a little bit about this in this book as also, where what Abhinavagupta says is that time still operates, but you're not as constrained by time in a subtle body. So say, George gets really good at leaving his physical body and he learns how to do this thing in like a dream time where he sort of leaves his physical body, travels with his subtle body or astrally travels, whatever, and is able to sort of like move around in that way. Then what happens on that level is that there's a little bit more flexibility in terms of time. That he can go a little bit into the future, a little bit into the past. Now it's not absolute. He can't just completely eradicate time, and he can't actually sort of necessarily go very far into the future or very far into the past. Although it may be possible to do more of this, but Abhinav says that there's still time. It's just that when you're in a subtle body, you have a lot more flexibility in terms of what you can do.
And is there any sense of parallel universe? So past, present, future, and then also parallel universe, so subtle body.
Right. Another great question. I mean, okay, he doesn't talk about that at all, period. And I personally, I know it's a really big topic in sci-fi, and I'd be curious to see what people like Kunal think since he's studying astrophysics, but I have actually really, I don't like that model. I think it may just be that I find it aesthetically distasteful, but I have also read a little bit of I have another paper coming out a little bit later in the year, which is on mathematics and intuitionist mathematics. And a physicist that I used for that paper, Nicholas Gisson, who's alive now, he's a French physicist, and he also he nicely articulated what was for me a sort of gut feeling about parallel universes. I don't really like it aesthetically. He actually articulates why he thinks, in a mathematical sense, why it doesn't really make sense. Okay, and of course, Abhinavagupta never talks about parallel universe. I mean, you do find it, I think, in other like some Buddhist texts, with multiple worlds. And I think you could also make a case that parts of the Yoga Vasishta, and again,
I was going to say that the King Levana story in the Yoga Vasishta and the Jain tradition clearly has multiple universes in parallel. And yeah, it's
Chris, this is for you then. What do you make of, like, reading through the Yoga Vasishta, one of the things I noticed was that King Lavana, actually, he goes through this experience, but later in the text, what you see is that he actually manages to go to the village where he lived his sort of momentary experience that lasted lifetimes. He actually manages to go back to that village, which is a real existing village, hear about himself having died in that village. So now you don't have a parallel universe in that reality. I don't know how you explain that, and I'd be curious to see what you think about that story. But initially I thought of that story when I came across it, I think through R.K. Narayan, as a kind of a parallel universe story. But then reading the actual text, I realized that he goes back and visits that village and hears the story of himself having lived there and then died. So then I thought, well, maybe he's actually just in a current life, actually, remembering a previous life, etc. I don't know. So I wanted to, that story always confused me. So if you have any insights, please share.
Yeah, I think the important takeaway is that he then becomes a very avid advocate for social justice and makes certain that his resources reach all people. Yeah. And that's, it's a beautiful, beautiful story. Then Judith.
Oh, can I also respond to one of Kunal's questions here? It says, is it possible to transcend the physical body while being physically embodied such that biological cells cannot strongly affect the functionality of the mind? What I would say, again, really, is that remember, this is a fermentation process, so that as above, so below. So what's happening on the physical body is actually, I think, because we're tethered to our physical bodies, if you transcended, say you've got into a very deep yogic state, you actually sort of left your physical body and moved to, say, a heaven realm where, and your physical body was just in a sort of comatose meditative state, because there is the tether from the subtle body to the physical body, that what would likely happen, I think, in this case, based on what Abhinav says and what we see in these various texts, that what would happen is that the biological cells are still affecting the state of mind. It's just that if you get a stronger, more enlightened or yogically expansive sense of subtle body, then it'll affect the physical body in positive ways. Okay, so that the biological cells will, in harmony, again, as Gayatri pointed out, in harmony, sort of work with that subtle body, and maybe, yes, you will have more input from the transcendent yogic being that's hitting the physical cells, but you'll still have that two-way street. Okay, so that's sort of how I would interpret that, basically.
Yeah, and then some of the science that I've read about is the telomeres, which are markers of aging, actually stay intact and increase through the meditation process.
Okay, great, yeah.
So to Judith, okay, let's see, where are we here? Judith, how about you tune in, because they're your words.
Yeah, so I think the idea of the fermentation body is fascinating. I think that the thing that I'd really like to emphasize from all of my comment, because I think you did a really great job of getting rid of Kurzweil, right? Yeah. But this whole movement of immortality becoming something that's in the hands of the elite only, right? So there's almost like an eliting of death. We're getting too poor to die. And once we die, we don't even have, there's not even not pie in the sky. There's nothing. And so, but so much, I think of this, the materialism perspective of what life is, and then how that follows us into the afterlife has become so much a part of this worldly experience, right? That there is no point to try to liberate or transcend. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I guess I just want to say that I think that one thing that I really hear from you is a way of encapsulating this that's really accessible to so many people. I wonder how more and more people can reclaim a sense of their life and their either only on life or possibility for afterlife, right? If they engage. We're so stuck in a paradigm now that it doesn't even matter. YOLO, you only live once on this earth. You bring, or I think you bring a nice way of expanding these ideas so that they can be accessible to more people. So I really, really like that.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much. And I know what you're saying, and it's right, spot on. That is that it's a materialist conception that is also, I think, kind of generating a little bit of fear porn, you know, which is sort of this whole idea of like, we have to be afraid of death because we only live one life. Okay. And I think that's really, you know, a big part of, you know, the problem there as well, too. Yes, I mean, so I agree completely with what you're saying. Okay. And I think you're bringing up a really good point when you say that require that consciousness emerges from the material. Now, Kurzweil is a little different than that because, or maybe not. He may not be as well either. You know, and that they, you know, like, oh, we've evolved to this emergentist possibility of consciousness, and that we don't want to lose it, so we better put it in a robot body, whatever. Yeah, we're bringing up some really good points. I do talk about emergentism elsewhere, and I know, and certainly people like Abhinavagupta, in the book that I have coming out, I actually have a long section where I talk about why Abhinavagupta is not an emergentist and why this model does not fit with his idea of what consciousness is. And I think that what it means for consciousness is if we go back to this idea of its subtle bodies, its bodies all the way down, its subtle bodies and more subtle bodies and more physical bodies, that it's always an interaction, an intermixture of these various bodies, then the whole notion of consciousness emerging from something, the physical body, doesn't even make sense anymore. It's like it's always been a kind of interactivity with consciousness, okay? And so that way you can have consciousness as a subtle body that's sort of interacts with the physical body and becomes a yogurt sort of reality with that physical body, and that that kind of admixture, the yogurt, the creativity of yogurt that comes out of this doesn't dismiss the body, but also entails, because bodies are also subtle bodies that inhabit new physical bodies that are being generated by two parents, you know, getting together and having a kid, that that brings something to the mixture as well. Okay, so that your memories of a previous life are also part of what makes up the new entity in this new body. You know, so they're both a part of it. It's not just like, and there is a sort of continuation of consciousness vis-a-vis a subtle body that existed before it incarnated in a particular physical body. And I think I'm understanding that's sort of what you want to get at as well too. But you tell me more if that's.
I think that Kurzweil is very much bound to an emergent consciousness coming from the material. That's why he's so hung up on computations per second, a certain amount of speed, that consciousness emerges and it cannot be separated from the machine, right? So what is being uploaded? I mean, you know, he came up with the singularity before the cloud. He talks now about uploading because he is always, he is a futurist and ahead of what's going on with the technology, but he also is always very much following the technology. But right, so the speed and memory, right? It's like a process, a computational process is what becomes the embodiment then of consciousness, and that's why he requires, as I said, the computational speed. He doesn't have the idea at all that consciousness is separate from the material at all. Consciousness emerges 100%. And I think that's a whole thing from all of this science fiction that we have, very much bound to the material. That is the self, and consciousness is of mind, right? Rather epiphenomenally from a byproduct of the machinations of the mind, of the brain. right? And that's very much Kurzweil. I think he talks about emerging from that particular type of paradigm, but he doesn't, right? The machination becomes a machine, the computational machine, and he can move it from the digital environment to quantum computing, or even analog machines coming out now, because all it takes for him, right, is this huge amount of computational power that somehow will result. Right?
Yeah, that's good. I mean, I have also written, I have an article that came out a few years ago where I talk about Tononi and Koch, who are two sort of contemporary neuroscientists who came up with a model of how to get consciousness, and they're quite serious about what they're saying. Now, it turns out with both of these fellows, what they had to do in order to make their model work is they have to assume a kind of panpsychism. Okay, and once you do that, you're already in a different ballpark, and then you're much more, amenable to what things like what Abhinavagupta is saying. So, I mean, Kurzweil, I think that many of the scientists who I see who are actually working on how actually can you get consciousness to come out of a material substrate, wind up actually having to seed a notion, something like a notion of panpsychism. Okay, and like that, every single model I've seen that actually really has any kind of coherence and cogency tends to sort of ultimately revert to some kind of conception of panpsychism. Now, Kurzweil's not doing that, and I think that's partly why his model doesn't work as well. So, and these are just neuroscientists like Giulio Tononi, who came up with IIT 3.0, which is integrated information technology third version, and that's what they tend to do. They all tend to sort of actually they wind up having to bring back in a kind of at least pervasive consciousness as another structure in the ball game. Okay, Kurzweil doesn't do that, but I think that's why. I mean, there's a lot of work on why emergentism doesn't work. I'm thinking also of Philip Goff, who's written a little bit about panpsychism and gosh, what's his name again? He's son of another famous philosopher who talks a lot about panpsychism, and he thinks of panpsychism in materialist terms. I have to think of his name again. I'll have to look it up. Yeah, it'll come to me later. But so I think that's also a failing of Kurzweil's. I mean, philosophically, a lot of people have critiqued the very notion of emergentism. It doesn't quite work ultimately.
Can I just end with saying, like, my ultimate expression of cynicism is that the Kurzweils, all of these materialists, and Chalmers. I've been out of this game now for about 6 years, right? But at that time, Chalmers was not necessarily on top of the consciousness game, but he definitely had the voice of consciousness and singularity.
Yeah.
But what will happen is, as the singularity obtains, right, which somebody will say, we have achieved this, consciousness will be whatever emerges within that playing field. So regardless of what discussions we want to have about what consciousness is, where it resides in places other than the computational ballpark, how consciousness emerges there will be the definition. The method, right, will determine the problem. Consciousness will be machine consciousness, just like intelligence now is machine intelligence. Right. Continue on.
Yeah, no, I think that you're right. And I think that here's where I would agree with George, that it might be time to go to a different higher realm. I still have faith in human bodies that are inhabited by gods, in sort of directing that in a slightly different way, but it may, your point is very well taken, and also expresses rather well one of my own sort of like fears about what will happen to humans if the model for consciousness is simply, computer computation. Then we'll see if they can evolve as well.
Well, I want to thank Loriliai and our wonderful audience here. And we just have grappled with the central question. Who are we? And can someone take control of us? And I think that in the Sankhyakarika, it says we have a linga, which is filled with bhavas, that these seek expression, and that what we must learn is discernment. So thank you all, and this will eventually be posted. And those of you who want to talk about going to India this summer, you can hang on, and otherwise, good night.
Okay, good night. Thanks, Fritzman, as well for your comment. That is Galen Strawson, yes. Okay, thank you all. Really nice, wonderful conversation. Really enjoyed hanging out with you. Maybe one of these days we'll be able to all hang out in person.
Yay.
Okay, all right, thanks. Okay, bye.